Before there was Ellen Ripley. Before there was Wonder Woman. There was the original action heroine, Atalanta. Now available at Amazon, Smashwords, and at studiobrainstorm.net. Links in the description. In the world of Vampire the Masquerade, it is very, very important that you know your place in society. The benefits of this knowledge range from helping you get ahead in society to simply avoiding being killed by someone far more powerful than you are. As a general rule of thumb, there are 4 things that can help you determine what your place is. The first is generation. That is, however many generations removed you are from Cain, the semi-mythical progenitor of all vampires. This determines your base power. The lower your generation, the closer you are to Cain, and therefore the more powerful you are inherently. The second is age. That is, however many years you've been undead. Not only does this also affect your power, as vampires tend to grow stronger in their abilities with age, but also helps determine your rank, as generally, vampires are a society where the oldest are often the strongest and therefore the ones in charge. Third is bloodline, the cultural/ethnic group that you are now part of by virtue of you being embraced by a member of that bloodline. These can range from relatively minor lineages like the Ananke, the Kiarsid, or the Gargoyles, all the way up to the 13 Great Clans, which claim descent from the original 13 antediluvians, although the Camarilla likes to deny that such beings ever existed. Bloodline determines not only your cultural background, but the kind of powers that you can have, as some bloodlines have unique abilities that only they possess. Although in 5th edition that sort of thing was thrown out the window, but that's another story. Fourth and finally, there is sect. Which socio-political organization do you belong to? Unlike the other 3 factors, sect is a matter of choice. Generally, you are inducted to the same sect as that of the vampire that embraced you. However, once you have gone through the initiation and are considered an adult member of the vampire community, it is possible to change allegiance, assuming that someone powerful doesn't object and tries to squash you. Even so, there are many instances of vampires switching allegiance to different sects over the course of their long unlives. The politics of vampire sects and the internecine conflicts between them in many ways define the political landscape of vampire society, particularly in the modern Knights. In short, you can't really talk about the world of Vampire the Masquerade without first addressing the sects, and you can't talk about the sects without addressing the event that spawned them. The first Anarch Revolt. Picking up where the first video left off, after Cain had passed judgment upon the antediluvians and the fall of the second city, the undead began to spread out across the old world, each of them seeking to stake out territory for themselves. Inevitably, as they embraced into their ranks humans from increasingly disparate cultures, vampire society began to divide along cultural lines. Take as an example the Libon, those vampires that moved into sub-Saharan Africa and embraced people from that region and were heavily influenced by their culture. Ditto for India, where the vampires there were so heavily influenced by Hinduism that eventually the bloodlines of the subcontinent adopted a policy of only embracing individuals from specific Hindu castes. However, the bulk of vampiric history within the world of darkness focuses primarily on Europe and the Middle East. From the Bronze Age to classical antiquity to the medieval period, vampires continued to live in the shadows, feeding on humans, occasionally embracing them, and manipulating their cultures and governments as it suited their interests. Even the rise of new puritanical faiths like Christianity and Islam did nothing to hinder their efforts. Indeed, many European vampires became devout followers of the Christian faith. Same for the Middle East, where vampires that had embraced the teachings of Islam formed their own cultural grouping known as the Ashira. And so the centuries rolled by. The fortunes of individual Cainites, their domains, and even their clans rose and fell with the times. Sometimes the eternal struggle known as the jihad flared into open violence, other times it remained in shadowy political maneuverings. But one thing remained constant throughout: the iron-fisted rule of the elders. Vampiric society, for all its intricacies, fundamentally boils down to two simple things: age and raw power. Vampires of lower generations are simply that much stronger than those of younger generations. And because vampiric abilities improve with age and experience, elders are inevitably more powerful and resourceful than their younger kin. The murder and diablerie of the second generation by their childer, the antediluvians, was an outlier, not the norm. And indeed, after that momentous event, vampiric elders went out of their way to make sure that the fate of the second generation would not be theirs. Vampires that survive undeath long enough to become elders are increasingly ruthless and paranoid with the passing of centuries. And so it went with the passing of millennia. Elders tyrannizing their younger kin, sires dominating their childer, often using and disposing of them as tokens or pawns in the great game of the jihad. As an extra insurance against betrayal, the elders made extensive and liberal use of the blood bond, thus rendering their subordinates all but incapable of rising against them. Quite evidently, the elders saw the greatest threats to their safety being from among themselves and their subordinates. The humans were nothing more than food. However, in the late medieval period, events would conspire to show the undead that the kind, whatever else they may be, were not docile sheep to be fed upon at will. The problem began with that most infamous of medieval screw-ups, the Fourth Crusade. Organized in 1202 by Pope Innocent III, the Fourth Crusade's goal was to reclaim the territory in the Holy Land that had originally been gained in the First Crusade but was recently lost to Muslim control during the Third Crusade. Unfortunately for His Holiness, the Fourth Crusade turned out to be nothing like what he'd hoped it would be. In a series of events that read almost like a Monty Python sketch, a combination of a lack of boats, scheming Venetians, and an unwise, ill-timed offer by a usurping Byzantine prince resulted in the Crusaders sacking the very Christian city of Constantinople, the beating heart of the Byzantine Empire, a deed that resulted in their excommunication by an outraged Vatican. The sack of Constantinople was bad enough for the mortals of Christendom. For the vampires, it was even worse. Lo these many centuries, Constantinople had been the focal point of the Dream, a utopian project millennia in the making, a project that ended in 1204 when the city was sacked. While the Catholic Crusaders were cutting down Eastern Orthodox Christians, several forces of enemy vampires, including the secretive organization known as the Inconu, the infamous Bali bloodline, and a cabal of caitiff or clanless vampires led by their insane prophet Stanislav, took their toll of Constantinople's vampire community, including its leading members. The most prominent final death on that terrible day was that of the Toreador Methuselah Michael, one of the founding members of the Dream, consumed by the Bali Mary the Black. As if the sack of Constantinople was a spark to kindling, the rest of Europe and the Middle East erupted into internecine war, the so-called War of Princes. Vampire Lord waged secret but no less bloody strife upon Vampire Lord, some in the name of their clan, others in the name of their faith, and still others simply to increase their own power at the expense of a rival. One of the many theaters of the War of Princes was a struggle for control of France between clans Ventrue and Toreador. One such Ventrue in this power struggle was a Methuselah by the name of Fabrizio Ufila, one of many vampires that had managed to successfully infiltrate the Catholic Church over the centuries. Around 1209, he became aware of a recent blow-up between the Catholic Church and a new sect of Christians in the south of France known as the Cathars. What was significant about this for Fabrizio was the fact that the Languedoc, that southern region of France where the Cathars were mostly concentrated, also happened to be the same area dominated by several prominent Toreador. Seeing an opportunity to advance the interests of his clan, and especially those of Alexander, the Prince of Paris, Fabrizio chose to use his influence within the church to inflame hatred of the Cathars by essentially accusing them of being devil worshippers. More importantly, he made the decision to let slip certain details as to how the righteous men of the church could dispatch these devils, ways and means of finding them and making sure that they were destroyed permanently. And so, when Innocent III, in conjunction with King Philip II of France, declared the Albigensian Crusade, the Crusader forces were accompanied by members of the Episcopal Inquisition, many of whom were armed with the knowledge Fabrizio had leaked to them, allowing them to winkle out the Toreador from their hiding places and make sure they tasted final death. 20 years later, the crusade concluded with the effective genocide of the Cathars and the breaking of the Toreador of Languedoc. Fabrizio had achieved his goals. The methods he'd employed were nothing unusual or novel. Vampires had been using humans as pawns since the beginning of the Jihad. His outing of the Toreador of the Languedoc was also nothing unusual. Although most vampires did adhere to the tradition of the masquerade in the Middle Ages, they didn't adhere to it nearly as strictly as they do in the modern nights. As such, in those days, it was still very commonplace for there to be people who genuinely believed that there were blood-sucking monsters going bump in the night. It was a far more superstitious age, after all. What he had done differently was that he had, albeit in vague and fragmentary ways, provided the Catholic Church and its inquisitorial apparatuses the ability to destroy vampires. The inquisitors of the Catholic Church now knew of the deadly usage of fire and the sun. Granted, Fabrizio had included a bunch of misleading information as well, like the idea that stakes killed vampires instead of simply paralyzed them. But the damage, however unintentionally, was done. The proverbial chickens began coming home to roost in the year 1216, when Innocent III died and was succeeded as Pope by Honorius III. In real history, Honorius III is mostly remembered for promoting the Fifth Crusade, picking up where his predecessor had left off, and for his approval of several important monastic orders, the Franciscans, the Dominicans, and the Carmelites. In the World of Darkness timeline, no sooner had he planted his holy buttocks upon the throne of St. Peter that the new pope decided to create another Inquisition. The Holy Inquisition against the devil and other demons, usually known as the Shadow Inquisition for short. Unlike previous and future Inquisitions, the Shadow Inquisition was deliberately kept a secret by the Church. As far as they were concerned, Christendom had enough problems as it is without causing a mass panic by revealing that there were actual literal monsters living among the populace. As it was, the 2 decades of experience in the Albigensian Crusade proved their worth. And while vampires were not the only supernaturals targeted by the Inquisition, mages, the fae, and the kinfolk of werewolves also died at the hands of the Church in large numbers. It is undeniable that vampires were the ones who suffered the most. And so began what came to be known as the Burning Times. Like an army of bloodhounds, inquisitors spread across Europe, killing the undead wherever they could find them, and in many cases killing people who weren't in fact undead, but were simply suspected of being such. Initially, the Inquisition was dismissed by the leaders of the vampiric community as no great concern. The vast majority of the Inquisition's victims were their younger subordinate vampires, and elders, being the callous sort, wrote them off as no great loss. And if the occasional peer fell into the hands of the Church, well, then that was one less rival to worry about in the perpetual games of power. But as the decades rolled by and the Inquisition entered into its 2nd century, it continued to refine and improve its methods of hunting down and destroying the undead. By the late 1300s, elders, princes, and even Methuselahs found themselves dying in uncomfortably high numbers at the hands of the Inquisitors. Your average Methuselah is thousands of years old. Most were embraced by the antediluvians themselves, with all the latent power that implies. But even the undead must sleep during the day. And when they sleep as if they are in fact dead, completely unresponsive to the world about them. Not to mention the fact that older vampires are more likely to spend centuries in a state of suspended animation known as torpor. No matter how old or powerful a vampire may be, while asleep, he or she is even more helpless than the very kind they feed upon, and who were now breaking into their sanctums armed with stakes and fire. And so, for the first time in millennia, the scions of Cain began to recall what it was to live in fear. Only the very oldest of Methuselahs could recall the last time that the kine had risen up to destroy the undead. That had been during the early Bronze Age, when vampires had still attempted to rule humanity openly. Now, even the most heavily guarded and hidden sanctum was not safe from these new ruthless soldiers of God. Even the most powerful elder lived in fear that one day, while he was still asleep, the enemy might find where he was hiding, stake him, and then drag his unresponsive body out to greet the sun. As more and more elders were forced to flee in the face of the Inquisition's wrath, they resorted to a desperate and ultimately foolhardy stratagem. Desperate and foolhardy, but not uncharacteristic. To save their own hides, they chose to deliberately sacrifice the unlives of their own subordinates. A common method was planting evidence that would guide the Inquisition to these younger vampires and then go into hiding, so that when the Inquisition had dealt with them, they would assume that all the undead had been purged from the local community and move on. Other accounts speak of elders simply embracing hapless humans and then abandoning the confused and frightened fledgling in the path of the Inquisitors. This did work for a while, however, some of those sacrificial offerings, despite their relative lack of experience and power, managed to survive. These survivors, burning with the rage of betrayal, began to spread the word of such treachery to their peers. More and more young bloods began to look with hostility and suspicion upon those who presumed to be their leaders. The situation finally came to a head in the year 1394, when a council of elders from multiple clans met at a location within the Holy Roman Empire to try and discuss means and ways by which they might survive the church's depredations. Although dominated by the elders, there were many younger vampires in attendance as well, and eventually one managed to raise her voice above the others. In life, she was named Patricia Bolingbroke, and she was a participant in the failed peasant rebellion by Wat Tyler in 1381. She had been embraced into Clan Bruja while in prison awaiting her execution. Eventually, after reconciling herself to her new position in, well, unlife, she had changed her name to Tyler, both as an honor to her fallen leader and to signify that transition. Although a mere child by Cainite standards, Tyler was not one to let lack of age or experience dissuade her from her goals. At the interclan meeting, Tyler expressed the belief that the vampires must come together and fight against humanity openly. Now that the Inquisition had mastered the methods of tracking down vampires, she believed that hiding was pointless, and that only in open combat lay the path to survival for the race of Cain. Unsurprisingly, most of the elders thought her suggestion to be sheer folly, an opinion given voice by the powerful Ventru Lord Hardestat the Elder. His alternative argument was that the reason the Inquisition had been so successful up till now was that the vampires had been too active in the open, that they had been lax in their observance of the first tradition, that of the masquerade. His solution, therefore, was that the vampires should continue to hide. More, they should use their influence within human society to persuade the kine that vampires no longer existed. The masquerade was to be enforced with the harshest of penalties. All who violated it would be sentenced to final death. In Hardestat's view, the only way of survival was in complete secrecy. Unsurprisingly, the younger vampires present at that meeting sided with Tyler, the elders with Hardestat. So of course, the elders' position won out. But Tyler was not one to accept circumstances as they were. She was Bruja, a clan in whom the blood ran hot, and the fury of the inner beast lurked close to the surface. Almost a year later, in 1395, Tyler successfully assembled a small army of angry younger vampires and launched a direct assault upon Hardestat's castle. Most of her allies died that fateful night, but she achieved something that was previously thought impossible. This young neonate killed and diablerized the Ventru Lord. There were attempts to cover up the incident, including having one of Hardestat's childer, Hardestat the Younger, assume his place, but word of Tyler's deed spread across Cainite society like wildfire. For younger and lower-ranking vampires everywhere, it seemed as though the impossible was now a reality. The authority of the elders could be defied, their power could be overthrown. The first shot had been fired. The Anarch Revolt had begun. At first, the elders were typically slow to react. At first, the Anarch Revolt was confined to Brujah territory, and so most elders were able to put it aside as not a matter of great importance. The Brujah were well known to be a clan to let their passions cloud their better judgment. But then the spirit of revolt began to spread to the youngsters of other clans, especially those domains in the south and east of Europe. Worse followed shortly thereafter, as the Anarchs formed an alliance with Clan Banu Hakim. As essentially the leaders of the Ashira community and devoutly majority Muslim, the Assamites had long resented the incursions of Christian humans and vampires into their lands, and had joined forces with the Anarchs as a means of gaining some form of revenge. Worse yet, sometime around the turn of the 15th century, a group of Anarchs from the Tzimitzi clan discovered a means of breaking the blood bond, meaning that absolute loyalty was no longer a guarantee for the elders, and even the most seemingly faithful subordinate could be turned against them. But the event that truly made the elders wake up to the danger of the Anarchs came in 1405, when the fourth generation La Sombra Gratiano de Veronese joined the Anarchs and then did the unthinkable. He diablerized his sire, the La Sombra clan Antediluvian. His victory complete, Gratiano brought the vast majority of Clan La Sombra into the Anarch movement. Only a small group of loyalists led by another child of the Antediluvian named Montano remained. These were mockingly referred to as the anti-tribu, those who went against the majority of the clan. 8 years later, in 1413, the Tzimitzi Lugos claimed to have achieved the same result, the diablerie of the Tzimitzi Antediluvian. By now, the elders were genuinely starting to panic. The last time an Antediluvian had been diablerized had been in the 1100s, when the mage-turned-vampire Tremere had done so to the Antediluvian of the Salubri clan. That had been bad enough, but the Tremere had wanted to join vampiric society, not overthrow it. And if beings as powerful as the Antediluvians, the grandchilder of Cain, could be overcome by these Anarch rebels, then no one was safe. However, these two diableries, the greatest victories of the Anarch Revolt, in many ways were exactly what spelled their defeat. Seeing an opportunity, the Ventru Hardestat the Younger picked up where his late sire had left off, renewing the call for elders of all clans to come together in common cause, both to hide from the Inquisition and now also to counter the threat of the Anarchs. Before, such an idea would have been seen as ludicrous, but with the destruction of two antediluvians and the Anarch movement building steam, fear proved to be enough to make the normally suspicious and self-centered elders of vampire society do something hitherto impossible: actually cooperate. Naturally, as self-appointed leader of the movement, Hardestat the Younger assumed the position of representative of Clan Ventru in this nascent coalition. There was a bit of a scare in 1444 when another antediluvian, Cappadocius of Clan Cappadocian, was diablerized by one of his own childer, Augustus Giovanni, but it soon became apparent that Giovanni was in no way aligned with the Anarchs and had taken over the Clan of Death simply to pursue his own interests. The elders were incensed all the same, but at this point, between the Inquisition, the Anarchs, and the Banu Hakim, they could not afford to open up another front in the conflict, and so, reluctantly, they decided to turn a blind eye to the Giovanni and their activities. One of the first clans to get fully on board with Hardestat and his plan were the Tremere. This is hardly surprising given that, one, if anything, they are the only clan more obsessed with obedience and hierarchy than the Ventru, and two, they saw this as an opportunity to gain actual legitimate acceptance by wider vampiric society. Given that they'd originally started out as mages that had turned themselves into vampires kind of by mistake, they'd always been in the doghouse with the rest of Cainite society since their creation. No one was really keen on this because, let's be honest, no one really likes the Tremere, including other Tremere. But in the end, the clan of the Warlocks were brought on board, and Mistress Fanchon served as their representative. Other clans soon followed with their own appointed representatives. Camilla Baines of Clan Malkavian, Josef von Baren of Clan Nosferatu, and Raphael de Corazon of Clan Toreador. Those Brujah elders that had managed to survive the Anarch Revolt thus far also joined in, represented by Adonidus Forza. Perhaps the most surprising achievement of the nascent camarilla was that they actually managed to get the independent-minded gangrel involved, represented by Milov Petronkov. According to some sources, a similar offer was made to the followers of Set, but they decided to say no. As for the Ravnos, apparently no one thought to ask them because frankly no one really cares about the Ravnos. Now organized and united by common cause, the elders of Europe began to turn the tide against the Anarchs and their Assamite allies. Even with the majority of clans Brujah, Banu Hakim, La Sombra, and Tzimisce on their side, as well as the ability to shatter the blood bond and thus bring other vampires into the fold, the Anarchs never really managed to outnumber the elders that would eventually become the Camarilla. And now that they were actually cooperating under the united leadership of the 7 founders-to-be, the elders also had the advantage of experience and superior organization and resources. As their very name implies, the Anarchs were often disorganized and without clear overall leadership. Some began to fight among themselves. Others, having overthrown their elders, simply went hog wild, terrorizing the local humans, which of course brought down the wrath of the Inquisition. Even as vampire fought vampire, the church continued to take its toll, and more often than not, those vampires that died at their hands were Anarchs. As the 15th century drew to a close, Hardestadt and the other founders-to-be could sit back and smile contentedly. The war was almost over, and victory for their side was all but inevitable. It was time to begin discussing how they would organize things once the revolt was finally put down. It was during these discussions, however, that Rafael de Corazon, the Toreador representative, raised a salient point: that the Anarchs had legitimate grievance. The revolt had begun precisely because younger vampires had been used, abused, and willfully sacrificed by their elders. The leaders of vampire society had abused their power and authority with no regard for their lessers. In doing so, they had violated the laws that had been set down for them long ago by Cain himself. De Corazon insisted that these grievances needed to be addressed and that the elders who presumed to lead vampire society should actually live up to their own standards, actually abide by the laws of their society, rather than simply enforce them upon the neonates and ancillae and then flout them for their own convenience. Most of the elders did not like this. Vampire elders tend to take the view of rules for thee but not for me. The idea that they should be in any way accountable to the grievances of their lessers was, quite frankly, offensive to most. But some, like Hardestadt, had the wisdom and foresight to see that Corazon had a point. Besides, the nascent Camarilla had already all but won the war. They could afford to be magnanimous in victory. And so the founders-to-be let it be known across all of Europe and the Middle East that they were willing to sit down and talk terms with the leaders of the Anarch Revolt. The Anarchs, recognizing the weakness of their position, reluctantly assented. And so it was set. The date would be October the 18th, 1493. The place, the Abbey of the Sacred Crown, situated in Hampshire, England, in the little village of Thorns. Next up, the organization of the Camarilla and the event that ratified its existence, the Convention of Thorns.